Back in the early days of C, programming was seen as a black art. Microsoft decided to change that, so they released Visual Basic. The masses were hooked. But along comes Java, a new programming language that works on anything. People started changing to the new programming language, and Microsoft felt as if their superiority had been threatened. So they hired one man, Anders Heilsberg, with the mission to make a programming language better than Java. In my opinion, he succeeded. That language was C#. I'm Wes, and welcome to .NET Paradise. Visual Basic and C# have a lot in common. This is mostly due to their shared backend in the form of the .NET framework. Thanks to the efforts of the Microsoft .NET team, a lot of what you need to know to program in C# is exactly the same as your prior experience from Visual Basic. Most of the difference is in the form of syntax, and that's mostly what this video is going to be about. So let's start by creating a C# project. It's quite similar to what you're used to in Visual Basic with one key difference. I'm going to pop open the Create New Project dialog. Make sure you have the Visual C# component installed, otherwise you're not going to get very far. Click it, hit Windows Classic Desktop, and we're just going to use a console application because the rest, as I said, is going to be very similar to Visual Basic. I'm going to leave the default name for now, you can name it whatever you like, and we're going to generate that project. Now the first thing you might notice when you pop open the file is the excessive number of curly braces. That is one of the defining features of C#, curly braces and semicolons. Another thing you might notice is all of these using statements up top. These are roughly equivalent to Visual Basic import statements, but you might question why we have things such as using system. In a Visual Basic program, you never would have written import system. That's because unlike Visual Basic, whose main objective was to make it easy for the masses to use, so they baked in a whole bunch of libraries, in C#, the development team was more interested in making sure that you were doing everything correctly. So they require you to import any libraries that you might use, yes, even including the system library. The rest of these are pretty standard, and these are the default imports for Visual Basic, if you will. You just have to explicitly type them out in C#. Thankfully, Visual Studio will do all that for you when you generate the program. Another aspect of that whole C# being more interested in being correct that I was talking about is it tends to be a little bit less forgiving. C# is case sensitive, for instance, so the variable lowercase, myvar, is different than the variable uppercase myvar. So you have to be a bit careful about that. So first of all, we're going to talk about these namespaces. You may or may not be familiar with what these are. We do actually have them in Visual Basic, but normally it's not required that you type them unless you want to have more than one. C#, however, does require them, and this namespace is going to be the generic name for your entire program. 99% of programs, you're going to use the same namespace in every file that you use, but it's good to notice that there is a difference. Another nice thing about this is it supports something called a dotted namespace. So if I want to have a dot in there, it will actually treat whatever comes after the dot as a sub-namespace, a namespace inside of a namespace. So if I would like to refer to this program from another program, for instance if I'm making a package or something like that, this namespace is going to be what you put in your using statements to reference those classes. Now, here, next comes the opening curly brace, and the reason we have the opening curly brace is simply because we have a closing curly brace. Why do we have a closing curly brace? Because we don't have the end keyword in C#. In Visual Basic, you might type namespace console app1, all of your code, followed by end namespace. In C#, we don't do that. Instead, we have these curly braces. Many C# programmers argue that this is a bit better because 2 curly braces is a lot less to type than one word end followed by, your word namespace or class or function or whatever you're ending. So that's the reason why it's there. Notice also that namespace is lowercase. In C#, most keywords are going to be lowercase as opposed to Visual Basic where they're mostly uppercase. Next up is our class. You should already be familiar with that. But again, notice lowercase, open curly, close curly. Next is this cryptic looking line of code, static void main. In C Sharp, we don't actually have true subroutines. There are no subs. Instead, we just have these things called void functions, which are functions that return nothing, which you can treat them as roughly equivalent to the Visual Basic subroutines, but it's important to notice that there are no subroutines in C Sharp. So the framework for creating a function looks as followed. First of all, it's going to be your return type, followed by the function name. As opposed to the Visual Basic syntax of function name arguments as return type, instead we just stick the return type in the beginning because we don't have any subroutines, so there's no real need to bother to specify that we're returning something, because in C Sharp you always have to return something. And the rest is what you're used to. It's going to be your arguments. However, one critical point. C Sharp, the types come before the names. So instead of saying args, thank you autocorrect, instead of saying args as string, while it may highlight things, that's actually not going to work, because in C Sharp, you have to have the type first. So it's going to be string args. Cool. Then you have your normal open curly, close curly, as you will get very used to typing. So what's the static keyword? Static in C Sharp is just their version of shared in Visual Basic. Your main entry point in a C Sharp console application has to be static, because, as you're used to from Visual Basic, the compiler needs something to latch onto and run. And we make that shared so that it doesn't have to instantiate an object of the whole program, which oftentimes could lead to some undesired effects. So you always have to have this static keyword in there, or, in Visual Basic, shared. The downside to that is it means any functions that you directly call from your main application, your main function, also have to be declared static, because if you're trying to access an object member without instantiating a copy of the object, something's gone horribly wrong. So if I had a function, for instance, that returns an int, which is the C Sharp equivalent of an integer, the other names are roughly the same. The other main difference is instead of single, they call them floats. So let's use float. If I wanted to have a function that adds two numbers, which I'm going to call float a and float b, we're simply going to say return, lowercase, a plus b, right? Not quite. Next thing, semicolons. Every line at the end of each line has to have a semicolon in C Sharp. The nice thing about that is it means you can have something like 50 commands on the same line as long as you have semicolons between them, but that's not good practice. So while that is a valid function, if I tried to call add of 1.0 and 2.0, this isn't going to work. First of all, because C Sharp is very pedantic about types, if you have a decimal in there, it's going to assume you mean a double. So we're just going to stick an F at the end to say we want these to be floats. Next problem is going to be an object reference is required for the non-static field method or property, blah, 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 blah. And that's to the whole static problem I was talking about. If it's not declared as a static function, it has to be inside of an object you've instantiated. So the easy way of fixing this is simply declaring it as static. Voila, all the errors go away, and your function works. Now, other than creating your own functions, we have our standard .NET libraries, right? So if you wanted to write something out to the console, you can simply say console.writeLine, as you're used to, and give it a string. And following with the age-old programmer tradition, hello world. Again, see this squiggly line? That's because I didn't put a semicolon. You always have to have semicolons. That's just how it is. If we run this program, we'd need to have a console.readLine so that it doesn't just instantly kill it. Actually, I'm going to use read key just so I can press anything. If you don't have that, it automatically shuts the window. A lot of programmers, when they're first starting out, and I'm sure many of you have had the same experience that I did, you forget to type in that at the end, so your window appears and disappears, and as far as you can tell, nothing happened. I had to spend at least 2 or 3 hours fighting that when I first started learning Visual Basic. So if we run the program and give it a second to build, we have our first C# program. Congratulations, you are now C# programmers. A few other critical differences, because most of what you're used to is going to be very similar once we get into these library functions, are things like new lines. Instead of a new line, which in Visual Basic, as I'm sure you know, is VBCRLF, Visual Basic Carriage Return Line Feed, instead of that, we have these things called escape characters. And the escape character is a backslash. And what that means is, what follows, I want you to use the special meaning of it, not just the normal meaning of it. So if I wanted to have quote marks inside of quote marks, then what I can do is if I put a backslash quote mark, the C# compiler will realize, oh, hang on, he's not trying to end the string, he's trying to insert a quote mark. So if I run that now, oops, I deleted my console.read key. If we have those escaped quote marks, they're called, because we have that backslash in front of them, notice how it'll actually print the quote marks. That's really useful because we can do things like, instead of that VBCRLF, there's just a return character for it. So, \n, an escaped n here standing for new line, will give us that new line we're looking for. So that's a nice little shortcut feature of C#. A couple of other escape characters are, for instance, \\, when you actually want to type in a backslash. You have \r, which is the carriage return, and what it did in this case is the \r just moves the cursor back to the first slot along that line, which is why we don't have the hello, because what it did here was it wrote hello, then it did a carriage return, which moves it back to the beginning of the line, and overwrote the word world. So that's a cool one to know. It's a lot easier than deleting everything. And we have things like the null character, which you probably don't want to have to use, but that's equivalent to your VB null. Careful with that, though, because that can cause some unintended effects, like your string ending right in the middle of nowhere when you're trying to send it off to a database or something like that. And interpolated strings work the same way. So if I have a, $sign in there, and I have these curly braces, then I can say add of 1.0f, comma 2.0f, and it should automatically interpolate the hello 3 world for us. There we are. Simple as that. Cool, so that's some basic string operations in C#. Now for a couple of other things. If you want to use a certain resource for a certain period of time, like for instance in Visual Basic you have your using, end using statements. C#, instead of that, we have using followed by the parentheses. This is a notation you'll see a lot, even in things like if statements, followed by the resource you'd like to use. So system.io.filereader, I guess we can use. Let's just use an actual file. We can do things like that, and then, of course, as always, curly braces. Obviously, you'd have to instantiate a variable in there, but just for the sake of showing you things. Also, if statements. First of all, again, if is lowercase, but you can't just type in the stuff and then the keyword then. That doesn't do anything in C#, because instead of then and end if, we use curly braces. Also, because of that curly brace notation, it needs to know when the conditional statement ends, so we actually have to use regular parentheses in there. So if true, for instance, parens, console dot write line true, if I could spell, semicolon, else, more curly braces, console.writeLine false. Now, one of the nice things about C# is Microsoft supports it a lot better. And what that means is there are many features in C# that we just don't have in the Visual Basic IntelliSense. One of them is it can figure out if there's unreachable code. Visual Basic has this to some extent, but the C# one is a lot more refined, so it can actually dynamically refactor the code for you and figure out when things aren't going to be reachable. So if I run this, it's going to say if whatever's in here is true, which in this case is just the word true. Notice again, lowercase. Run this, close that if, else run this. So if we run that, oops, always forget that, don't I? All right, we run that, we get our true. If we switch this to a false, false, voila. And again, that unreachable code bit's a bit cool. So another thing is you can't just use else if one word. You have to use else if two words in C#. I know in Visual Basic you're supposed to use else if two words, but some people, including myself, oftentimes neglect to do that. So just one of those things where you have to be very careful. You have to have that space and everything's lowercase. Again, parentheses for your arguments. Voila. Okay, that's if statements. Next up, we are going to take a look at instantiating objects and variables and things like that. So first of all, no dim. Get that out of your head. You don't need it. In C#, we always put the type first, so all we have to do is put the type of the variable. So if I want to make a new string called s, I simply type in string s equals hello world. And from there on out, you can treat it like any other Visual Basic variable, except don't forget, case sensitive. So I can do my console.writeLine s console.readKey and hello world. Another thing we've got to be careful about is string concatenation works differently in C# and indeed most of these C-derived languages, in that instead of using the AND sign you're used to in Visual Basic, C# uses that instead of the keyword AND, like when you're doing Boolean checks for things like if this is true and this is true. C# actually uses a double AND sign for that. So what that means is you can't use the AND for string concatenation. So instead, you just use a plus sign. However, you got to be careful, because if you think that these are numbers and they turn out to be strings, you've just stuck the numbers next to each other. So this plus sign is used not only for addition in C#, but also for string concatenation. We run that, hello world. Great. This works for not just strings. All variables are initialized like this, so I can have an integer that's equal to 5, or 4. I can have a float, which is a single, don't forget, equal to 4.0. F, because it's a float. Again, C# is very strict. I can have doubles, and that should be lowercase because case sensitivity, equal to 4.0. We can do booleans, which in C# have actually just been shortened to bool, and other types like that. However, there is one master keyword, and a lot of people prefer it. I personally choose not to use it because I think it's a little bit sloppier, but it's equivalent to just, not giving a type in Visual Basic. If you just type in dim without giving it a type afterwards, it will sort of figure out what type it's supposed to be for you. And in C#, we have a keyword for doing that, and that keyword is var. That's the closest thing we have to dim in C#. And that will just auto-type for you. It'll figure out the type. Cool. Next up comes instantiating objects. If I have a class myObject, brackets, instead of having that sub new in Visual Basic, we have public, and you just give it the name of the object, myObject. Great. So, when you're working with objects, be very careful about that. It's not sub new. You don't need a return type. You don't need a function. You just give it the name of the class. So if we wanted to instantiate this object, we would type in myObject, the name of the type, obj, or whatever type you want to give it, equals new my object. There is no shorthand, as new in C#, which is unfortunate, quite frankly, because that is a wonderful shortcut. But in C#, that's how you instantiate new objects. Type name equals new object name, followed by any arguments that you need to give it, just as in Visual Basic. And that should cover most of the differences between C# and Visual Basic. They are, as I said, quite similar. So thank you for tuning in. As always, I'm Wes, and this has been .NET Paradise. Enjoy. See you in the next video.